Now we will look into esophagus, right, which is one of the part of GI tract. Esophagus, as you can see in the diagram, this is the esophagus, right? That starts from the pharynx, right, and ends in the stomach, ends in, to be precise, in the superior portion or the superior end of the stomach, right? And its length is 25 centimeter, right? Its length is 25 centimeter. Now let's look at its position, right? Its position with respect to the surrounding organs. So esophagus, it starts, let's look at the other diagram that will help you to understand its position, right? Approximately here. This diagram shows, here it is, here you have the esophagus, right? And above esophagus, you can see you have laryngopharynx, right? So this muscular tube, right? Esophagus is a muscular tube. It consists of only muscles. It starts at the inferior end of the laryngopharynx, right? And you can see anterior to esophagus, you have here, this is trachea. Trachea is a windpipe, right? That helps you to take in oxygen or to take in air, right? And it sends air that you take from outside into the lungs, right? So here you have two tubes. One is your trachea that helps to take air and send it to the lungs, and then you have esophagus, right, which is posterior to the trachea. You can see trachea is in front, right? At the back, that is posterior to it, you have esophagus, right? Here you have esophagus, and this is your trachea. And here you have laryngopharynx, right? So its position is at the inferior end of laryngopharynx, right? And posterior to the trachea, the windpipe, right? Now, if you look at this diagram, it further continues, right? It's going like this, right? Then it further continues. Then it passes through the mediastinum, right? What is mediastinum? Mediastinum is part of thoracic cavity that contains the organs of the chest except lungs, right? It's basically a space between lungs, right? So let's just take down some important points. Its anatomy is, it starts at the inferior end of laryngopharynx, right? We know laryngopharynx is a part of pharynx, right? And after food is swallowed, the food passes through pharynx into your esophagus, right? Its inferior end anatomy is, it's at the inferior end of laryngopharynx, right? Then you have its posterior to trachea, the windpipe, right? Then you further come down, it further comes down, right? It passes through the mediastinum, which is a part of thoracic cavity, right? Passes through the mediastinum behind the heart, right? Then it further comes down, it pierces the diaphragm through an opening called as esophageal hiatus, right? This is very important. So you can imagine, if you look at the diagram, you can imagine from where all your esophagus is passing, right? Then it passes through mediastinum. It passes through mediastinum. It's behind the heart, right? So now you know your esophagus better, behind the heart, right? And anterior to the vertebral column, right? Anterior to vertebral column. And what is vertebral column? It is a space that contains your spinal cord and the surrounding fluid, right? It's basically your spine. Anterior to vertebral column, right? Then it pierces your diaphragm through the opening known as esophageal hiatus. This tells you your position of esophagus, right? Then it further comes down, then it ends at the superior portion of your stomach. Here it ends at the superior end of, or let's write it as superior portion of stomach, right? So this is it. This is the anatomy, right? Its position in your body. And what is its function? Basically, if we talk about its physiology, what is its function? Its function is to transport food, right, from mouth to the stomach. This is its main function, right? It transport food from your mouth to stomach. Now we'll be looking into some more parts of it, right? And before this, its function, which is we have just seen, to transport food from mouth to the stomach, it's aided by some waves, right? We call that phenomena as peristalsis. This is very important, related to esophagus, peristalsis, right? What happens is your esophagus, the wall, we know it's muscular, right? So the wall of the esophagus contracts and expands on its own, right? So since it's doing on its own, we have no control over this expansion or contraction of esophagus, right? We call it as involuntary contraction, right? And this involuntary contraction of esophagus generate waves, right? And it is this wave, right? It is these waves that transport foods towards the stomach, or these waves propels food towards the stomach, right? So peristalsis, basically it's due to involuntary contraction of muscle of the wall of the esophagus, right? That generates waves, and which helps propelling food towards stomach, right? And these waves, right, this peristalsis occur throughout the GI tract. That is your esophagus, your small intestine, your large intestine. Everywhere you have this peristalsis, right? But this peristalsis is very strong. These waves are very strong in your esophagus, right? It is so strong that suppose you are eating something, and if I turn you upside down, right, then also due to gravity, the food will not move away from the stomach, but it will still move towards the stomach, right? So it helps, right, for the food to reach its next destination, which is stomach, right? Doesn't matter what your position is, right? And if we talk about peristalsis in your small intestine, food stays for 3 to 5 hours, right? Because your maximum digestion and absorption occurs in small intestine, right? So peristaltic waves are feeble or weak in small intestine because food has to stay there and it has to digest there, right? So this is how your body is naturally made. And food doesn't have to stay in esophagus, right? That is why the peristaltic waves are so strong that it quickly propels the food towards the stomach, right? So basically, your esophagus doesn't produce any enzymes, right? There is no digestion taking place, right? So there is no point of food staying there in that pipe, in that muscular pipe, right? So it's quickly propelled towards the stomach, and from stomach it goes into the intestine, the small intestine, right? And further, these peristaltic waves are strong in transverse colon of your large intestine, transverse section of your large intestine, because there the undigested food would be propelled towards the rectum, right? So this is all about peristalsis, which is important, right? When understanding the movement of food in your GI tract, right? Now we are done with peristalsis. Let's look into a little more. This esophagus, right? It has two sphincters, right? One sphincter, it has two sphincters, which again has very important part to play in movement of food, right? Two sphincters, right? First sphincter is is between pharynx and your esophagus, and this sphincter, which we call as upper esophageal sphincter, right, that guards the movement of food from pharynx into the esophagus, right? So you call it as upper esophageal sphincter. Let's abbreviate it as UES. I'm sorry, it's UES. U. I'm sorry. Right? It's UES, upper esophageal sphincter, right? And it guards the movement of food from your pharynx to esophagus, right? And we know these sphincters are circular valves, right? These are circular muscles, right? That guards the movement of food in forward direction. It would not let your food come in the backward direction. If food is coming in the backward direction, that means there is some problem, right? So movement of food in the backward direction, in the reverse direction, or the reflux of food indicates some condition or maybe a disease. We'll just look at one of the disease, right? So do you have upper esophageal sphincter here somewhere that guards the movement of food from pharynx into your esophagus, right? Then you have one sphincter somewhere here, right, that guards, we call it as lower esophageal sphincter because it is at the lower end of your esophagus. This is your lower esophageal sphincter that guards the movement of food from esophagus towards your stomach, right? And your upper esophageal sphincter consists of skeletal muscles, and your lower esophageal sphincter consists of smooth muscles, right? So lower esophageal sphincter consists of smooth muscles. Let me just write it over here. It consists of smooth muscles, and this consists of skeletal muscles, right? And the basic function of sphincters is to continue the forward movement of food, right? What happens is, suppose when the food enters from esophagus into the stomach, the sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter closes. It closes itself, right? It automatically closes so that the food may not move or start traveling backwards into the esophagus, right? Now there is a condition that we call as gastroesophageal disease. Uh, you call it as gastroesophageal reflux disease. Reflux means backward movement, right? Or backup. So you have gastroesophageal reflux disease, right? Due to which the food which is in your stomach, right, which is in your stomach will start backing up or will back up into your esophagus, right? Because probably your sphincter has gone weak, right? And sometimes it happens actually this sphincter, which is lower esophageal sphincter, is a little weak, right? Because sometimes you might feel that you feel some kind of burning sensation or acid, right, in your stomach due to food that is in the stomach. It packs up little into your esophagus, right? But when this condition is common or prominent, then you have um, this disease, gastroesophageal disease, right? We call it's a condition then within your body, right? And you know that you have acid in the stomach, right? So due to this backing up of contents from stomach into your esophagus, you will feel burning sensation near your heart, right? Because esophagus, as I said, in its anatomic position, that it is behind it is in front of it's kind of at the behind you have heart, right? At the back of esophagus you have heart, right? So it feels some burning sensation near your heart, but right, but it doesn't indicate any cardiac problem or any problem related to heart, right? And this is your heartburn, we call it as heartburn, right? And it is due to acid that reflux or moves back into the esophagus, right? So just remember this. This is important. Now let's talk about the histology, right? Histology of esophagus. I have a diagram, yeah, right? And there's one more diagram. I forget to show you that diagram. This diagram clearly shows you that this is the windpipe, your trachea, and this is your esophagus, right? So from here, food moves to the stomach, right? And from here, the air moves into your lungs. And you can easily see its position that esophagus is posterior to the trachea, right? And it continues, it moves down, right? It passes the mediastinum, right? It pierces the diaphragm, then it connects to your stomach, the superior end of the stomach, right? So this is better diagram. Now, this diagram will help us to understand the histology of esophagus, right? This is a cut section of your esophagus, right? You can easily see you have different layers because basically in histology we are doing a tissue study, right? And we know that any organ, it is made up of tissues, right? We have layers of tissues, one over the other, and it's important thing. This is the lumen, right? The black portion, this represents the lumen of your esophagus through which food moves, right? It's an empty space kind of thing, right? But we have longitudinal folds in your esophagus, right? That closes this space, that closes the lumen when there is no food and prevents air from entering into the esophagus, right? So the longitudinal folds that are present in your esophagus, that helps from air not entering into the esophagus, right? And basically it helps, and the longitudinal folds basically helps to for this esophagus or for the lumen to close, right, when there is no food in the esophagus, right? And you can see the outermost layer is your muscularis, right? Then inside this is before this you have submucosa, right? Then you have mucosa, right? Mucosa is a layer, right, which is in direct contact with the contents of your esophagus, right? So the mucosa of the esophagus, and we know that it's mucosa. It consists of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It consists of lamina propria, which is your aerolar connective tissue, and a muscularis mucosa. right, which is smooth muscle, right? And one more thing, near the stomach, right, mucosa of this layer, the mucosa of your esophagus contains muscle gland, mucus glands, I'm sorry, right? And we know that esophagus secretes mucus, right, and transports foods into the stomach, right? So we didn't discuss this before. Just remember that esophagus secretes mucus, right? That helps to lubricate the food and it moves the food in forward direction, right? And it does not have any digestive enzymes and it does not carry on absorption, right? So no digestive enzymes. No digestive enzymes and no absorption in esophagus. Right? And there is one important thing. Okay, the outermost layer is your muscularis, right? And muscularis of the superior third of esophagus. That is, if this is your esophagus, say, then from the upper end, the third of your muscularis is your skeletal muscle, right? The intermediate third is your skeletal and smooth muscles, right? And the inferior, that is below, is your smooth muscle, right? Near the stomach, the muscles of the esophagus are smooth muscles, right? Then there is one important thing. We know that esophagus is passing through the mediastinum, right? And in the mediastinum, you have surrounding tissues, surrounding connective tissues, right? And the superficial layer of esophagus is known as adventitia, right? There is one thing, we call it as adventitia, right? Which is the superficial layer of esophagus, right? We don't call it, rather calling it serosa, we call it as adventitia, right? Like it's labeled over here. We know that outermost layer is mainly, we call it as serosa, right? We call it as adventitia because the areolar connective tissue of this layer is not covered by mesothelium, so we call it as adventitia. And one important thing is, because the connective tissue merges with the connective tissue of the surrounding structure of mediastinum through which it passes, right? So this adventitia attaches or helps esophagus to attach with the surrounding structure, right? Since I said it's passing through the mediastinum and you have surrounding tissues, right, in your mediastinum. So this superficial layer of adventitia, which consists of connective tissue, it helps esophagus to connect with the surrounding tissues, right, which is again connective tissues, right? So the connective tissue of surrounding structure of mediastinum through which it passes, right, merges with the esophagus, or I'm sorry, the esophagus, better we say that the esophagus merges with the connective tissue of the mediastinum, right? So the adventitia attaches esophagus to the surrounding structure. Its basic function is that it attaches esophagus to surrounding structures, right? I hope this is clear, right? I hope esophagus is clear to you now, right? There is one thing that we didn't discuss, that when we talk about peristalsis, peristalsis is controlled by the medulla oblongata in the brain, right? We'll be talking about more about peristalsis, right, in a different video lecture. I'll make a small lecture on peristalsis, right? So I hope this is clear. Continue watching. I'll be making next video on stomach, the next organ, right? Thanks.